Very nice to be here this afternoon, and thank you for being inside on such a beautiful day, because it's really gorgeous, isn't it? I was going to start off in a slightly more provocative way with the statement, "It's just a pile of rocks in a field." This was an American tourist was over here, heard saying this at Stonehenge just recently, and my friend Tim Dorr, on whose land the experiment about Stonehenge is going to be carried out, being Tim, has had them made into T-shirts. So. But it's not just a pile of rocks in a field, obviously. It's an incredibly special place. I'd like to introduce myself. I am an archaeologist. Sounds a bit like a confession, doesn't it? But I've been an archaeologist for more years than I now care to remember. Started digging in 1969 and been doing it ever since. And it's been a great pleasure to do that job for all this time. And I was very lucky in 1980 to be asked to carry out a project in the Stonehenge landscape. So the first time I started working there, the Stonehenge Environs project, which was looking at the surrounding landscape, not Stonehenge itself, and trying to answer some of those fundamental questions like where did people live and what state the monuments were in a landscape that at that time was still being quite heavily ploughed. And I've been involved in it ever since, and as I've kindly said in the introduction, I've written the new Stonehenge Guidebook, and probably my greatest claim to fame, though, is having produced the world's only Pop Up Stonehenge book, which I've sold more copies of than anything else that I've sold. And if you've ever seen a brilliant video on YouTube called "What's the Meaning of Stonehenge?" Have any of you seen that? Yeah, it's a very strange show. It's a Norwegian chat show host called Ylvis, who does this unbelievable song called "What's the Meaning of Stonehenge?", in which my Stonehenge pop-up book is used in a sexual context, which is quite interesting. As an archaeologist, I'd like to sort of reference somebody whose name has already been mentioned. This is Sir Richard Hoare of Stourhead House, who studied that same Stonehenge Environs landscape in the early years of the 19th century. And in his book, his great 2 volumes on the ancient history of Wiltshire, proudly stated, "We speak from facts, not theory." And I suppose this is the basis on which I'm coming. I'm an archaeologist, I'm a scientist, I'm talking about the few facts in prehistory that we have, the geological data, the radiocarbon dates, the isotope work, the artifacts. And I suppose, not really like Hoare, we use those facts to create theories. And I'm aware that Stonehenge is a place that generates a massive amount of interest and excitement and ideas. And indeed, Jacquetta Hawkes said that, every generation has the Stonehenge that it wants. And really, every person has the Stonehenge they want. To some people, it means very different things. But what I'm talking about this afternoon is from an archaeological point of view. And I've already mentioned the fact that we're going to be doing this experiment. This was 1995. This was in a BBC programme called Secrets of Lost Empires. And that's what we're going to be building again next year. That's 2 40-ton uprights and a 10-ton lintel, which we are aiming to move and raise by hand, experimenting with different ways of doing it. So if you're interested in having a go, coming and giving us a hand, or indeed if you've got ideas, if they're sensible ones, then get in touch with me through my website and the email address on there. So it's going to be quite interesting, possibly slightly dangerous. And beyond my archaeological interest, I've also had a fascination with what my son very kindly refers to as Dad's Stonehenge tat, which is souvenirs of Stonehenge that show the different ways in which people have visited and appreciated the monument over the years. And my collection is currently on display in the Stonehenge Visitor Centre in their temporary gallery, and it's everything from Victorian souvenir china to Japanese phone cards, which illustrate the fact that this wonderful monument of Stonehenge is a global icon. It's the one prehistoric site that you show anybody an image of it anywhere around the world and it's recognised. I've also been lucky to be the co-curator of an exhibition that's actually on in Austria at the moment about Stonehenge. and something I'll be talking about briefly later on, the results of the Stonehenge Hidden Landscape Project, this big geophysical survey. And this is they're slightly more portable versions of Stonehenge, made out of fiberglass, but full scale. Now, what I'd like to do is to start off, and I hope this isn't sort of teaching you all to suck eggs, but just to actually start looking at what Stonehenge is, its physical structure, because I think we all think we know it, but I just, for the, if you bear with me, just like to go through what effectively it is. Because I think to a lot of tourists who come and visit it, they look at the stones, and it's the stones. And obviously, sorry, if Stonehenge didn't have its stones, it wouldn't get 1.2 million visitors a year. That's what makes it so different, so visitable. But as you can see from this wonderful photograph in the snow, there's more to it than that. There's an encircling earthwork, there's the avenue heading off down out into this incredible landscape, which fortunately these days more people are visiting. But what we can see here are the ruins of a stone structure and the eroded earthworks, and there's clearly more to it than that, because the stones are in their final position. Some of them have been moved around, stones are missing, some stones have been raised. And also there's the hidden archaeology of Stonehenge, the buried part of it that's only come up through excavation. So if I can, which is the bit that points it. So we have an outer earthwork. And of course, Stonehenge supposedly being a henge, to an archaeologist, a henge is an enclosure with its bank outside its ditch. So Stonehenge doesn't fit because its bank's inside its ditch, which of course means that we can refer to it as a developing henge, a proto-henge. It has that main entrance that we've already heard talked about, that heads off in a northeasterly direction from which the avenue runs out. It has its back door, its minor southern entrance down here. It has 4 station stones, originally in a rectangle, just inside the inner edge of the bank. And again, something that's been mentioned. I think the battery's gone on this. Yep, that's faded. Hang on a minute. There's a solution to this. And here we have the Aubrey Holes, these 56 pits that lie just inside the inner edge of the bank. We have 2 circles of pits, the Y and Z holes, which lie outside the stone structures before we get to that central arrangement of stones. And of course, what we also have are the post holes of timber uprights that occur quite extensively both in the interior and in the entrance, which were discovered by excavation, and which people often tend to want to turn into some sort of circular structure within the monument, but which really don't actually work like that. If you were approaching Stonehenge, and we've already talked about, or somebody's mentioned about, which way do you go? Do you go from the river to Stonehenge? Do you go from the river in the opposite direction? But if we assume that you're approaching Stonehenge up the line of the avenue, which incidentally wasn't there in the early stages of Stonehenge, the first thing you would come to is the Heelstone. And this is now a historic photograph because, of course, the road there is gone now. That is no longer the view with cars whizzing by past the Heelstone because that part of the road has been closed as part of the new improvements. But that's a sarsen, one of these hard red sandstones from the Marlborough Downs, about 25 miles to the north. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not worked because virtually every other sarsen inside the structure has been shaped, has been worked. And there is the possibility, which we'll come back to a little bit later, that that particular sarsen, the Heelstone that now stands upright, was a natural stone that was there in that place. And we've got clues about that from depressions in the chalk that have been found close to it. And also the fact that there is another stone hole in the road verge, which was discovered in 1980. So the Heelstone wasn't alone. As we move into the entrance of the earthwork, there's this recumbent stone called the Slaughter Stone. And this is a wonderful example of Victorian imagination because it's got hollows on the top of it that where the rainwater collects stain a rusty red. So this was clearly the blood of the sacrificial victims that was collected in these pools. Well, that's okay, except that it stood upright. So that doesn't work. It doesn't work as a sacrificial altar. And it's one of a number of stones that were upright in the entrance. And of course you can see in the background the small station stone, another small unworked sarsen, and it's just inside that now quite low and eroded bank that the circle of Aubrey Holes were found, about half of which were excavated in the early 1920s. And there's still discussion about what they held. Did they hold timbers? Did they hold stones? If they were stones, they were clearly blue stones because they're too small for sarsens. But really, to be quite honest, despite what you read quite confidently in some things, the jury is still out on this. We don't know what those holes held. If we move towards the centre, what we see then is the ruins of the stone, the central stone temple, effectively. And the stones here are colour-coded in two colours. The brown ones are the sarsens, the blue ones are quite logically the blue stones. And what we see here is the restored ruin of a structure in its final stage, about 2200 BC. Because we know that the blue stones in particular were rearranged. They're slightly more portable than the sarsens. Once the sarsens were in place, then they simply didn't move. That outer circle, if that outer circle was the only thing that was at Stonehenge, it would still be the most amazing stone circle in the British Isles and indeed in Europe, because there are several unique features about it. Now, I use the word unique in its correct way. I'm not saying that Stonehenge is fairly unique, but there are several unique features. Firstly, it's the only stone circle where stones have been moved over any sort of distance. Every other stone circle that we know in the British Isles, the stones are effectively local. Even the sarsens here have been moved a distance of over 20 miles. Second thing is that the stones are shaped. Again, a unique feature. No other stone circle has shaped stones. And thirdly, it's the only one that's capped with horizontal lintels, which is what gives it its unique visual character. That outer stone circle, beautifully shaped uprights, if it was complete, and we have to say that we're pretty certain that it was completed, but there are slight problems with this, would have consisted of 30 upright sarsens, very evenly spaced, except there's a slightly wider gap between those two stones, which actually reflects the main alignment through the entrance. So 30 uprights capped with 30 horizontal lintels, and those themselves are truly remarkable because, as you're probably aware, they're locked together using joints that you'd normally expect to find in woodworking. You have two protruding tenons on the top of each upright, corresponding with mortise holes on the underside, and then the ends of the stones are locked together using mortise and a tongue and groove joint. So it's an extraordinary complex structure. And if that was complete, if that circle was complete, with these gently curved lintels, because the inner and outer faces are curved, and they're also completely horizontal, despite Stonehenge sitting on a slight slope, you'd have had a beautiful ring, smooth ring of stone suspended above the ground in that outer circle. There is a slight problem, that stone, stone 11, because it's in the right place to be an upright of that outer circle, but it's too small. It's not wide enough, it's not tall enough. And it's a real problem because I have had it suggested to me that it fell down in prehistory and was reshaped and put back up again. But it's a real problem, that. It does lie immediately adjacent to the southern entrance, so whether it represents a sort of a back door or not, I don't know. But that's the one thing that maybe says that part of the circle wasn't complete in the way that we think it was. Inside that circle, and this is the best preserved section with its 3 linked lintels, we have a circle of blue stones. These are unshaped pillars of stone that come from the Preseli Hills in Wales. Broadly from that area, I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. They're not shaped, they're a mixture of rocks, spotted dolerites, ordinary dolerites, rhyolite, volcanic ash. And again, that main entrance is accentuated by having the 2 biggest slabs placed either side of it with a slightly wider gap again. So that key alignment through there is maintained in the circle of bluestones. That, incidentally, is concrete. That is a repair put in by the Ministry of Works in the 1950s. Inside that, we have the 5 trilithons. These 5 freestanding structures, each of 2 uprights with 1 horizontal lintel, which sit in a horseshoe and are graduated in height. So the 2 on the open side are the shorter, then there's a pair of larger ones, and that stone 56, the sole surviving upright of the tallest trilithon, with its broken pair next to it and the huge lintel lying flat on the ground. And we have no idea when, telephone? We have no idea when those stones fell. They may have fallen in prehistory, because that is a remarkable stone buried very deeply in the ground. It was straightened up in 1901, but leaning at an angle, a crazy angle, but still didn't fall over. Its pair, maybe they were stretching themselves to find a stone that was actually equal to that would give them the tall trilithon that we needed. What you can see, I think, from this is that, apart from the fact that is an unbelievably beautiful squared lintel, the stones, the uprights of the trilithons vary. One is always very smooth, one is slightly rougher. And it seems to be quite deliberate. We see this all the way round each of the trilithons. But this is the question when we start to try and read meaning into it. What does it mean? Was it nature and art? Was it male, female? You know, what can we read into this? This is the problem that I, as an archaeologist, find, that science doesn't enable me to get into the minds of the people that built this, because it's all about the people and their beliefs and this incredible achievement. But it's one of the frustrations. And somebody's always said to me, what would you really like to happen in your lifetime? And I said, I'd like somebody to invent a time machine so I can actually go back and find out what was really going on there, except that it would then put all archaeologists out of work. But I'd still love to be able to go back to Stonehenge and find out what it really meant, because I don't pretend that I understand it completely. Inside of that horseshoe of trilithons is a horseshoe of finely worked bluestone pillars, again gently graded in height, rising up towards the back of it, and including this remarkable example with a vertical groove worked down its whole length. And these are consistently of the nicest of the bluestones, the spotted dolerite, a lovely blue-grey colour with white spots. And then at the heart of it, and again it's using names that are quite evocative, underneath the ruins of that great trilithon is a flat slab of stone which is known as the altar stone, because it sits in the place where an altar would logically be if this was effectively a temple. It's a flat slab of stone from fine-grained sandstone from the Brecon Hills in Wales, but we've never seen more than glimpses of it because it's always lain buried underneath the ruins of that trilithon. So hopefully you can see there is a symmetry. Circle, circle, horseshoe, horseshoe, and it goes sarsen, bluestone, and there's the altar stone. But as I say, the arrangement of the bluestones is their final arrangement. Prior to this, they sat in a double circle with a small oval in the middle. And as we'll see in a minute, there are keys to different arrangements even beyond that. You can see the way that some of these stones have suffered. This was the most recent excavation inside the stones in 2008, where you can see the jagged stumps of a bluestone that's been broken off. You know, that's all you see now at ground level. And what this excavation revealed is that there's been a lot of disturbance, certainly in this part of Stonehenge, including a lot of pit digging by the Romans, who may have not simply just visited the site as tourists, but may have adapted it as a shrine and may indeed even have moved some of the bluestones around. Because effectively, they are more portable. They weigh up to about 3 tons. So getting one of those out, moving it, is not really that big a job. Once the sarsens are in, they don't move. Nobody's going to move a 90-ton trilithon just because they decide that it's in the wrong place. But what excavations have done is given us clues as to different arrangements of the bluestones. Because in the 1950s, this amazing stone was revealed. It's a bluestone that was eventually set up as a pillar, but it's got mortice holes in it. And there's another one that you can still see half buried in the grass today. This one is now unfortunately reburied. But what that is, clearly, is a lintel from a miniature bluestone trilithon, of which we know that there were at least 2. But where did they stand? Did they stand here? Because it's very difficult for us to find the holes to fit them in that would make them into little trilithons. Or did they stand as miniature bluestone trilithons somewhere else? Possibly even in Wales. Because there is this question of, did a collection of building material come from Stonehenge, or was it actually an entire stone circle that was dismantled in Wales and brought to be incorporated in Stonehenge? I'm using this next slide. This is of a structure that became known as Foamhenge, that was built for a Channel 5 documentary. Because what it does is it shows the contrast between the stones, which is something you don't see today because they're covered in lichen. The sarsen, when freshly worked, would have been very pale. The blue stones would have provided a contrast in greys and greens and blues. And we don't see that today. But this model did actually give you that sense of contrast. Where it failed was when the wind blew and stones went bounding down the hill, sort of shedding fragments of polystyrene. But while it was still in one piece, it was a very good indication of this changing colour. Now, I've mentioned about the stones. We know that the sarsens come from the Avebury area in North Wiltshire, because that is a stone landscape. Did you go there a couple of days ago? Was there a trip there, or are you going there? You've not only got the standing stones, every field's got stones in the hedge, every building, is made of sarsen. It's a stone landscape. The blue stones broadly come from the Preseli Mountains in Wales. How they got to Stonehenge, we honestly don't know, because unfortunately nobody conveniently dropped one on the way, which would give us a clue about where they've come from. I personally think the likelihood of them coming all the way around the tip of Cornwall and up the River Avon is slightly unlikely. I suspect it's more like that. And it has been pointed out recently that this side of the Preselis is incredibly rough, and they may well have gone more in that direction down to the Avon and then down to Stonehenge. But we don't know. All we know is that they started here and they ended up here. And you'll still find some people who say they were brought to that area by geological transport, that they were brought there by glacial transport. I have never seen any evidence for that at all. There are no other glacial erratics in the Stonehenge area. And a geologist a few years ago studied 50,000 river pebbles from the River Avon and didn't find a single glacial erratic amongst them. Now, there's dedication. So I personally am quite happy with the idea that they're brought here by human transport. And of course, when you go to places like Carmen in the Preselis, you can see it's a very dramatic landscape. It has a real sense of presence about it. The rocks fissure into natural slabs. And I mean, this one, it's brilliant because it's just sitting there propped up on a couple of others, and you almost feel that it ought to have "Deliver to Stonehenge" chalked on the side of it. But what we don't know is when that was placed there, because there's obviously a lot more historic quarrying going on. And you may have heard recently announcements that archaeologists got it all wrong, the stones didn't come from Preseli. Well, actually, they did. They came from broadly this area. But whereas in the past we thought that a lot of the dolerite came from this particular outcrop at Carmenin, there are now other outcrops. This is Carn Godog, where Mike Parker-Pearson's team have been excavating in a rock face, because that geologically matches precisely one of the stones at Stonehenge, and found what appears to be a monolith split off and almost ready to go. The puzzling thing here, though, is that the radiocarbon dates for this quarrying are before 3000 BC. So that again might lend weight to the fact that there may well have been a bluestone circle in Wales at an early date that was later dismantled and brought to Stonehenge. And of course, again, that leads us to this question of, well, if there was a bluestone circle in Wales, did it have shaped stones? Did it have miniature lintels? Was it, in fact, the inspiration, what we see in a much bigger scale at Stonehenge in Sarsen? I'm asking a lot of questions and not providing the answers, aren't I? But this is the nature of archaeology. Now, if we just look very briefly at the the history of our understanding of Stonehenge. It was very easy for the medieval mind to explain it away because it was clearly the work of giants. Merlin flew a stone circle over from Ireland, dismantled something called the Giant's Dance, and flew it over and put it up again on Salisbury Plain. And this was, quite acceptable bit of history, and it stayed in the history books for many centuries. When we get to the 17th and 18th century and the beginnings of, antiquarianism, early archaeology, when these early antiquarians looked at Stonehenge, what they saw was something far more sophisticated than any other stone circle. And of course, to them, they couldn't actually quite grasp the fact that this could have been built by the ancient Britons, because to them, they were skin-clad, woad-smeared savages. All they had were the descriptions of Roman writers. So they couldn't have built Stonehenge. It was too sophisticated. It had to be Roman, because the Romans obviously introduced architecture and an element of civilization to this country. Well, we know that that's now wrong. But the lengths that people went to prove this. This is Inigo Jones's plan, where he proved that it was Roman because it was symmetrical. But actually, if you look at his plan, he's added another trilithon and bent them round slightly to sort of make it symmetrical, and it doesn't actually look like that at all. But that was proof as far as he was concerned. It was actually that antiquarian that we've already heard mentioned, the person who recorded a lot of elements of the Stonehenge landscape before they were ploughed away, William Stukely, and also to whom we owe a huge debt for our understanding of Avebury, because Stukely recorded elements of Avebury while they were in the process of destruction, and his notes and plans and sketches are incredibly valuable. He's the person to whom we owe the fact that we now know that there is a second avenue at Avebury, the Beckhampton Avenue, because he recorded that and was disbelieved for centuries until within the last 20 years, archaeologists have actually gone out and proved that it existed. But Stukely accepted the fact that Stonehenge was a British monument. And to him, there was a logic that it was a British monument, it was a temple. A temple needs priests. Who were the only priests that we know about from the time before the Romans? It's the Druids, because the Romans mentioned those. So to Stukely and a lot of other later antiquarians, Stonehenge was a Druid temple. And that's in some ways where the lasting association with Stonehenge and Druids has come from. In the early 19th century, I think the first person, beyond Stukely, to realise the importance of that landscape was Sir Richard Colt-Hoare, because he explored very widely what he called Stonehenge and its environs. He was the first person to coin this idea of the Stonehenge environs as part of his study of the people of ancient Wiltshire, because he wanted to understand ancient Wiltshire. And to him, the way to do it was to excavate, but actually to excavate quite specifically. He excavated barrows, along with Cunnington and their team of labourers, because barrows produced objects which they could use to understand the people of the past. It's an interesting approach that he took. And of course, this is his landscape map drawn by Philip Crocker, showing the cursus, the Stonehenge Avenue. And interestingly, Stukely and Colt-Hoare could only see the avenue as far as that because it was ploughed away. It's only when aerial photography revealed the rest of it in the early 20th century that we realised that it went all the way down to the River Avon down here. But a wonderfully systematic piece of work, numbering all the barrows, recording what was in them, the nature of the burial, and also keeping the objects so that we can now go and see those objects in the museum in Devizes at the Wiltshire Museum, where they have fabulous collections that they've just redisplayed of all of Colt-Hoare and Cunnington's finds from the barrows around Stonehenge. Their methods to us may seem crude. Two workmen dug a hole down through the middle of the barrow until they got to the burial, at which point they removed the objects that were there, leaving the bones where they were because they had no interest in the bones. They couldn't tell them anything. You'll find a description of how the skeleton was laid and terms like we returned the bones of the British warrior to his ancient resting place. So there was an element of respect there, but that's what they felt could tell us about the people. The unfortunate thing is, at that time, there wasn't even an awareness of the three-age system, that there's an age of stone, an age of bronze, and an age of iron. So they were trying to sort out objects of stone and of bronze and of iron, and tended to look at them in terms of status. You know, if you were posh, you had bronze. If you were slightly less posh, you had iron. And if you were a peasant, you had stone. So they weren't looking at it from a chronological point of view. And in fact, while supposedly understanding the people, Colt Hoare, at the end of his researches in that landscape, his exact words about Stonehenge were how grand, how wonderful, how incomprehensible. He simply couldn't get his mind around Stonehenge. And if we look at the guidebooks from that time, we'll see again the reflection of the period. This is Brown's Guidebook of 1823. Based on a biblical chronology in which the world was created in 4004 BC on the 23rd of October, Stonehenge was one of the few solid buildings that survived the Great Flood. It was an antediluvian structure. And really, even by the end of the 19th century, when William Judd wrote his guidebook in 1893, to him it was still, and his exact words, it was a druidical erection. So that was how he saw Stonehenge, even at that time. And that was the state of Stonehenge at the end of the 19th century. An isolated ruin, sitting on the downs, on the sheep-grazed downs, well away from the villages, well away from the plough, and well away from people who might have gone there and quarried stones away. Yes, stone breaking had taken place. I mean, Stukely records people with going up there with what he calls great hammers and knocking chunks off. But it was effectively an isolated ruin. And what we've seen in the 20th century is various stages of restoration that have given us the monument that we have today. The straightening of that leaning tallest stone in 1901, an exemplary piece of work where every find was planned and the soil was sieved. We saw the restoration work of 1919 and afterwards, after Stonehenge had been bought at auction and given to the nation, which actually straightened up stones that were being propped up by stones, by wooden pegs. And then in the 1950s, the raising of an entire trilithon that had fallen over in 1797. So I get very annoyed when people say, oh, it's all made up. No, it's not. It's actually a restored ruin where stones have been stabilised and straightened. No other stones have been introduced. And with the exception of raising that entire trilithon, which is something that we wouldn't do today, that's the only bit of actual stone raising that's taken place. And of course, all of this work was accompanied by excavation. But I have to say, not necessarily by publication. And this work was largely supervised by Richard Atkinson, who in 1947 wrote, "Excavation without publication is a crime against science," and then never wrote anything up. So it had to wait until late in the 20th century, when all of the 20th century work was pulled together, to get some idea for the first time of what the chronology was at Stonehenge, what the sequence of events was. And we know that now that the ditch and the bank are the earliest elements in around 3000 BC. But that bizarrely, they were placing bones on the floor of the ditch that were several hundred years old, that were heirlooms, particularly around the entrance, cattle skulls that had clearly been regarded as important and kept for centuries. We know that the major change happened about 500 years later, with the raising of the sarsen structures and the blue stones in this double circle arrangement. And in this reconstruction, the problem with stone 11 is neatly fudged by just having a gap there with but you can see the blue stones are in a completely different arrangement to what they are today. And in this reconstruction by English Heritage, they've actually added the two miniature bluestone trilithons flanking that entrance, although there's actually no real proof of that. And then, as I say, what we see after that is the rearrangement of the blue stones into a circle and initially an oval, which then turns into a horseshoe. And the final, happens in about 2200 BC, and the final physical structure that's built here are the two circles of pits that are dug in about 1600 BC. So this means that Stonehenge has a 1400-year time of construction and modification. It's at that time, late in its use, that we see the development of these amazing cemeteries around Stonehenge. That if you stand at Stonehenge and you look around you, every ridgetop has got barrows silhouetted against the skyline, very deliberately placed linear cemeteries designed to be visible from Stonehenge. This is part of the Normanton Down Barrow Cemetery with these beautiful disc barrows, and the barrow with a bush on it is Bush Barrow, the one that produced probably the most famous grave group in the Stonehenge area, the gold decorated daggers, the gold lozenges. And when we cleared the scrub off these about 10 years ago, we left a bush on that one so that when you stand at Stonehenge and people go, which one is Bush Barrow? You can go, it's the one with the bush on it. So that's a good reference point. But at this time, Stonehenge was clearly still significant. And this is what makes it so unusual, because the monuments of the Avebury landscape, Silbury, Avebury, the West Kennet Palisade enclosures, all of those late Neolithic monuments, that was effectively the last gasp of the Neolithic. And you haven't got massive round barrow cemeteries around Avebury. What you have in Stonehenge is a landscape that continues in significance with the development of these cemeteries. And Stonehenge itself continues to be significant, not just the digging of those extra circles of pits, but the decoration of the stones. Because these are the first carvings that were found on the stones, a dagger and an axe blade. These were spotted by Atkinson in the 1950s, and we now know that there's over 140 axe blades and about 3 daggers carved on the uprights of the trilithons, all below head height, and these are going in about 1800 BC. So a long time after those stones were raised, but showing that this place was still special, it was still venerated, as well as the dead lying on all the surrounding hilltops around it. And I think it's a very interesting example of people still in the 1950s wanting to look for a more sophisticated influence on Stonehenge, because when that dagger was first discovered, the immediate reaction was, oh, it looks like a dagger from the Mycenaean shaft graves. So it must have been a Mycenaean architect that built Stonehenge. No, the shaft graves are a lot later than that. It's not a Mycenaean dagger, it's a perfectly normal sort of Wessex dagger. But you see, we've even seen this recently, because I'm sure many of you have heard of the Amesbury Archer, this phenomenally rich burial that was discovered in Amesbury, over the other side of the river, a couple of miles from Stonehenge. Wonderfully rich burial, beakers, lots of beakers, copper daggers, some of the earliest metalwork in the country, somebody who's probably a metal worker because he had metalworking tools with him, a bad leg, which we'll return to in a minute. But isotope analysis of his bones showed that he wasn't a local. And initially, he was thought to be German. So this is how the tabloids saw this. Achtung, Great British Monument, complete with comedy German. And again, you see, look, archaeologists believe the king of Stonehenge might have been involved in the creation, it might have been built by a German. Still looking for sort of an outside influence. No, he arrives far too late, anyway, to have any influence on the rebuilding of Stonehenge. And if he's so important, why is he buried over 2 miles away on the other side of the river? He's a wealthy trader, metalworker, very important, very rich, but he's got nothing to do with Stonehenge. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on the question of how Stonehenge was built, because it's actually, in all honesty, we don't know. We can do experiments to show how stones were moved and raised, and if that experiment works, we can say that method works, but that doesn't tell us that that was how it was done. So, you're an intelligent audience, you realise that dinosaurs died out a long time before Stonehenge. The great thing about this card was that English Heritage used to sell it at Stonehenge in the 1980s. And I'm convinced that a lot of, particularly tourists from certain countries, bought it and thought that that was actually how Stonehenge was built. But, you know, as I say, we don't honestly know. There are ways of moving the stones. You can use rollers. This is a group called the Stone Engineers, using a method that they call stone rowing, where you use a series of levers, raise the stone up and row, and the stone moves forward. That's a possibility, but that's only 12 tons. So does it work with 40 tons? You know, there are lots of suggestions. There are clearly some suggestions, and I do get sent quite a lot, that just simply don't work. You know, like the recent Russian one that I was sent, explaining that it was quite simple. You simply built a canal from the River Avon and you floated the stones up, maintaining the water level with a series of shadoofs. This person has clearly never been to Stonehenge because it's on top of a hill, nowhere near the river, and chalk is possibly the most porous rock that you can get. So, you know, we'll ignore that one. But exactly how it was done, we simply don't know. All we know is that they did it, that these people are incredibly ingenious, they are skilled engineers and stonemasons, and we will hopefully next year, with our experiment, might be able to shed a little more light on some methods used. Because effectively what we're going to do is to invite ideas from people. They will be vetted by an engineer to see whether they're feasible. They will be vetted by our health and safety person to see whether people will actually get killed in the process of doing them. And if they pass those two tests, then the answer is, there's a 40-ton stone, there's 150 people, show us how it was done. So it should be quite interesting. August next year, we think. But of course, the fundamental, you know, the really big question, even after we've gone through who is it, is why did they build Stonehenge? What were the reasons behind it? And there are lots of different ideas within the archaeological community. And I personally look at all of them and evaluate them, and I've got my own ideas. But what I'm going to do is just to explain some of the main ones at the moment. Now, Mike Parker Pearson, who led the Stonehenge Riverside project, sees the area around Durrington Walls, the great Henge monument and Woodhenge near the river, as being the land of the living, because here you have timber circles. And according to his Madagascan colleague, Ramisalina, then timber is for the living and stone is for the dead. So this is quite simply the land of the living. And when you die here in the land of the living, you make a journey down the River Avon, the transformation from life to death. You go up the avenue, the route of the ancestral initiates, and you end up at Stonehenge, where you're buried. Now, elements of that work, because at Durrington, they did find, buried underneath the end of the Henge bank, the remains of houses. Small, rectangular chalk floors, central hearth, and traces of stake-built walls around them. And these are what you see now reconstructed as replicas at the Stonehenge Visitor Centre, project carried out by the Ancient Technology Centre at Cranbourne. So yes, people were living there. So you can't deny that. People were living actually there, probably quite a lot of them. It's the other side of it that sort of gets slightly more complicated, because by where the avenue joins the River Avon, they discovered that the avenue didn't run right to the river, but stopped at a henge, another small henge, inside which were pits lined with flint nodules, which Mike predicts, if the circle was complete, would have been 24, which is a significant number. And Mike calls this bluestone henge, because he said that those holes held bluestones. Now that's an interesting idea, except that no bluestone was found on site, not even the tiniest chip of it. So I think that the jury's sort of still out on that one slightly. But of course, if you go up the avenue and you end up at Stonehenge, you have a slight problem because the avenue wasn't actually built at that time. Certainly not the bit beyond this. It wasn't built to several centuries after the people were living at Durrington. So that side of it doesn't work. There are dead people at Stonehenge. There are cremated remains that were found in the 1920s in the ditch, in the bank, and in some of the Aubrey Holes. And again, because the archaeologists didn't know what to do with them, they tipped them all back into one of the Aubrey holes that they'd excavated in 1935, and they were re-excavated in 2008. So what there was in the bottom of that pit was a mass of cremated bones, including very recognisable fragments of our ancestors, end of a pelvis, part of a skull. Ancient cremations tend to be much better surviving, the bigger bits of bone. And what analysis of those has told us is that there's a mixture. There's men, there's women, and there's children represented within these 50 or 60 burials, the fragments of which are in that pit. But the radiocarbon dates from them show that they're quite early in Stonehenge's history. They date from between about 3000 BC to about 2600 BC. So in other words, you can't live here in 2500, go up an avenue that isn't built for 200 years, and be buried at Stonehenge 200 or 300 years earlier. Chronologically, it doesn't work. Yes, Stonehenge is a place of burial, and it later becomes a focus for burial. All of these are the round barrows that lie within that landscape. But that particular scheme doesn't really work. Another idea, this coming from Jeff Wainwright and Tim Darville, who've done a lot of work in Preseli, is that the answer lies with the bluestones, that they have healing powers, or they're thought to have healing powers, and that in Preseli you'll find little standing stones often associated with springs, and the water is thought to have healing properties. So what you're doing by bringing the stones from Wales is you're bringing the healing properties. So they use a phrase which I hate. Tim's described it as the Lourdes of ancient Wessex, that people came to Stonehenge looking for healing. And when they did their excavation, they found that a lot of the bluestones had been broken up, and their idea behind this was that people were taking away fragments because of the healing properties of them. And they also suggested that that's what drew somebody like the Amesbury Archer with his bad leg halfway across Europe to come to Stonehenge to look for healing. Well, that's as maybe. But the other suggestion that a lot of the barrows around Stonehenge had the remains of people who were showing signs of either disease or injury, and that that's what had drawn them there, simply can't be substantiated, because the burials are still all in the barrows where Cunnington and Colthall left them, because they weren't interested in the skeletons. So I'm afraid that doesn't work. It's an interesting idea, but it can't be proved. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with this, that main solar alignment. And as it says, there's an arrow now in the grass near Stonehenge. Is it the midsummer sunrise, or is it the midwinter sunset? Because it works both ways. If you go at midsummer and you actually get a dawn, then the sun rises and shines not directly over the hailstone, because remember there was a pair, but it shines broadly down the line of the avenue and into the open side of the horseshoe. This was taken at a Stonehenge summer solstice celebration, and I have to say to all of you that I don't go anymore because I don't like it at summer, because I think Stonehenge is treated with massive disrespect. I hate to see Stonehenge covered in litter, bottles, cans, food, and, to be quite honest, last year, vomit. That's not, to me, how to respect a place like Stonehenge. But that's the midsummer. Or is it the midwinter, when the sun would have set between the uprights of the tallest trilithon and in a very dramatic way on the shortest day? And I do go to the winter solstice. Now, that's that main alignment. That side of Stonehenge is very much more fragmentary. There's that funny little stone. And what laser scanning has shown recently is that that side of it are the largest, most regular and best worked stones, implying that you're meant to see Stonehenge from that direction, which means that you're looking towards the midwinter. And if you want to see sites that only work at midwinter, we've already heard from an acoustic point of view about Newgrange, midwinter solstice, sunrise, the light shines through the light box into the chamber. We've heard about Maze How, only works at midwinter. And there's other evidence as well. Durrington Walls, there are huge quantities of pigs killed and eaten there. They're feasting on roast pork. And the indications are that those pigs, there's a big peak in the slaughter of them around midwinter. So that's when the major feasts are taking place. Bizarrely, they're also shooting pigs with flint-tipped arrows, which is a very odd thing to do, because if you want to try and kill a pig, that is not the best way to do it. It just simply makes an angry pig. So there's something strangely ceremonial about the way some of the pigs are being slaughtered there. But of course, you hear people say, it's just about healing, it's just about burial, it's just about the summer solstice or winter solstice. All I say is go 8 miles down the road to Salisbury Cathedral, and we can quite accept the fact that that is a place that is built for worship, that it has a particular alignment, that it's a place where people came looking for spiritual and physical healing, that it's a place where the wealthy came to be buried, that it's a place where commerce took place. All of those we can accept being embodied in that structure. So why can't we accept that Stonehenge, over its long life, has got a series of meanings which have changed through time? Now, I'm sorry I'm going on a little bit, but I just want to say something at the end about some of the new research that's taking place, because one of the most interesting bits of research that's taken place recently has been the amount of geophysical survey carried out within the landscape, because techniques now are developed to the extent that you can mount 6 magnetometers behind a quad bike and whiz around a field at about 15 miles an hour and do high quality geophysical survey. Or you can stick a radar kit on the front of a little tractor, again GPS located, and drive around the field, and you can get extraordinary results. And this is the extent of the area that's been looked at by the Hidden Landscape Project. There's Stonehenge, there's the A303, New Visitor Centre is here, there's the Cursus, there's Durrington Walls. So a massive area, and more is being done. There's a couple of interesting things to point out here. That unbelievable mess there is the site of the Stonehenge airfield, and that very messy area there, and this may be familiar to some of you here, is the site of the Stonehenge Free Festival, where 20,000 people camping in a field and lots of people having little campfires and things has produced the most unbelievably messy results on the geophysical survey. So yes, it's ceremonial activity, but of a slightly more recent date. But what this survey has done is it's revealed something that I suppose we've known for a long while, that this landscape is full of smaller, similar ceremonial sites. Lots of small pit circles, henge-like structures, and also that some of the sites that seem quite straightforward, single round barrows, when you look at them, particularly using radar, have got layers within them. They've been enlarged and enlarged and enlarged over a long period of time. So they're not just simple one-off monuments. And then, of course, what it's done as well is enabled us to see underneath some of the long barrows in this landscape, which haven't got stone chambers. This is a raw survey of the flanking ditches of a long barrow that's quite close to Stonehenge. But when you look at the detail that comes out of this, you can see the facade here and the underlying timber structure. So effectively what we've got here is a house of the dead, a timber mortuary house lying underneath the barrow. And it's this sort of detail that's absolutely fascinating. But I think one of the most intriguing discoveries so far has been at Durrington Walls, where under the line of the bank on the southern side, a whole series of readings came up. And you probably saw a lot of the publicity about this last year. There was a big splash about new stone monument in the Stonehenge landscape, because all of these are interpreted by the Hidden Landscape team as being stones. Now this really, if they are, is going to throw the cat amongst the pigeons in terms of interpretation, because what are all these additional stones doing in the landscape? In a landscape where there aren't natural sarsens. And I do disagree quite strongly with Wolfgang, the leader of the group, about the interpretation here, because yes, this is what they think the stone structure looked like. I don't agree with the white cliffs of Durrington. I really don't like that at all. But the question is, what really is there? And we're going to find out this summer, because in the first 2 weeks of August, there's going to be an excavation about here over the site of one of these supposed stones, which will answer this question once and for all. In terms of what the most exciting discoveries, I think, have been in the landscape in recent years, I think the houses at Durrington, because that's given us our first glimpse into the lives of the people who were there at the time Stonehenge was built. Whether or not those are the houses of the builders or not, but it's people at the time of Stonehenge. But also, re-excavation of an early trench across the avenue has maybe given us one of the first clues about why Stonehenge is where it is. Because I've already mentioned the fact that the heel stone may be a natural stone. Lying on the ground, yes, raised upright. But what this excavation also showed was that where the avenue ditches lie now, they're based on geological features, on periglacial stripes that run down this hillside in precisely the main solar alignment. So they would have been visible as natural hollows in the ground. And of course, they show up best in winter with snow or frost. So could it be that this unusual stone and these strange solar-orientated lines that appear at Midwinter actually is what led people to build Stonehenge there? Because that's a question that I've never been able to answer before. Why here? So that's our first archaeological clue. And I think the other major recent discovery in the landscape has been what's been going on at Blickmead, down by the side of the river. Because here we've got a very, very important Mesolithic site. And the setting of this place really encapsulates the Mesolithic wildwood, the stream here. But what's significant about this particular place is that there are warm springs here. There are springs that come up that stay at a constant temperature of about 15 degrees, so they never freeze in winter. You can actually see the circles here of the water bubbling up. And they also have a bizarre property in that flint that lies in those waters grows an algae that when it's exposed to the air goes that colour. It's an absolutely bizarre transformation that happens within a few hours. So this place must have seemed very magical to the people, to the hunters and gatherers who lived in this landscape long before Stonehenge. A place where animals would come to drink, where the stone turned a miraculous pink, and where the waters never froze. And the excavations there, through these river sediments, have revealed a real density of Mesolithic activity, thousands and thousands of flints, and interestingly, the bones of aurochs, the giant wild cattle of this time, including auroch bones with flint points embedded in them. So these people are hunting these giant wild cattle, which I personally wouldn't. I'd have to be incredibly hungry to try and hunt an auroch because they're scary beasts. But again, claims have been made that this is the cradle of Stonehenge. It's a very important site, but whether it's got a direct connection with what goes on thousands of years later is another matter. What we do know is that it's contemporary with post holes that were found in the Stonehenge Carpark in the 1960s and which date to the 8th millennium BC. So these are put up, these are pine posts put up by people who should not be doing this. They should not be building monuments. They should not be raising what may well be totem poles. But they do. And is it significant that they're actually very close to where Stonehenge was built maybe 5,000 years later? These are built at the same time that the Blickmead site is being used. And again, you get all sorts of fascinating ideas, and I've tried to steer clear of rubbishing some ideas, but when I see people suggest that sea level was about 100 metres higher, that Stonehenge was effectively by the seaside and that those posts were the mooring posts for boats that delivered the bluestones to Stonehenge, then that is the point at which my archaeological patience gets very, very worn thin. Just to finish off, we're getting also some hints as to why we're getting complexes of monuments developing in certain areas, like Avebury, like the Dorset Cursus area, like Stonehenge. Because environmental data from the very early part of the Neolithic, is showing us that rather than the dense forest, the impenetrable forest that we've always assumed developed after the end of the Ice Age, what you're getting is the development of what's more like a tundra environment, a very open environment that then develops into a grassland, but not this dense treed landscape. And of course that would make these places very appealing to early farmers. Light soils, well-drained soils, and not a massive cover of trees to remove. And this may help to explain why certain areas develop these wonderful complexes. I was very lucky in 1981 to excavate a pit on Coneybury Hill, which emphasised this transition between hunters and gatherers and early farmers. A pit containing 46 pottery vessels, thousands of animal bones of wild animals and domesticated animals, flint tools. It showed two worlds meeting. And to me, it's the most exciting thing that I've ever excavated. And it's great pleasure for me to have some of the finds on display in Austria at the moment. So there are things that we don't understand. If anybody can explain to me why, when I went out to the landscape a couple of months ago, on the Kingbarrow Ridge, I found this, some neatly constructed cairns of flint pointing directly at Stonehenge. I have got no idea who did it and what it means, but somebody did it because it meant something to them. And this is what I find fascinating, that this landscape and this site means different things to different people. I've given you my perspective as an archaeologist, dealing from facts with what I hope is a desire to understand the people who built it. I work under the title of Archimedia, that's my company, and my strapline is bringing the past to life, which I try to do in as many ways as I possibly can. Stonehenge has been a place that I've loved being involved with and hope that I will be for years to come. I never failed to be fascinated by going into the stones, which I've been lucky to do twice in the last 2 weeks, and also working out ways in which I can give my enthusiasm to other people. And I'd like to finish you with a way that we try and do it with children when we're doing projects with kids about Stonehenge, and that is you get them to build their own Stonehenge in the classroom. We found that biscuits on their own don't work well because the kids eat the ingredients before they built the stones. They're not quite so keen on eating raw vegetables, but there we are. A cucumber altar stone, trilithons, the outer circle, it's all there in a way in which I hope the kids will get something out of and develop the same enthusiasm and passion for Stonehenge that I have. I hope I haven't gone on too long, and thank you for your patience.